What do you think of when you hear the phrase historic preservation policy? And why is preservation policy a big deal? In this video, I will cover what preservation policy is, how it fails to be people-centered, and how, through a focus on social justice, it could change to be more inclusive and equitable. While I'll assume you're a preservation professional whose work is impacted by historic preservation policy, every American should know something about these issues. My name is Jeremy Wells, and I am an historic preservation scholar, teacher, author, consultant, and musician. My latest book, Managing the Magic of Old Places, Crafting Public Policies for Human-Centered Historic Preservation, was released by the University of Tennessee Press in October of 2025. I am an expert in U.S.-based and international historic preservation theory, practice, and public policy, social science applications in historic preservation, community-based preservation and urban planning, and higher education teaching and administration. So what is historic preservation policy? Simply put, policy refers to the way that local, state, or federal governments systematically make required or guided decisions on topics that impact the public. Preservation policy is commonly understood to take the form of laws, regulations, and guidelines that governmental agencies use to implement an historic preservation program for the benefit of the public. Of all the areas of paid professional historic preservation work in the U.S., regulatory compliance, which exists because of historic preservation policy, makes up almost 3/4 of the field's practice. According to some estimates, there are about 20,000 people who work in the historic preservation field in the U.S. If there was no historic preservation policy, almost 15,000 people would not be employed today. So what's the takeaway here? The vast majority of historic preservation work in the U.S. is driven by local, state, and government requirements, which is one reason why historic preservation policy is a big deal. Most preservation employment is not in architecture or the construction industry. It's not in museums and historic sites, and it's not in advocacy. It's in government or private sector jobs such as cultural resource management that supports government. Because, for reasons I will explain shortly, the federal version of preservation policy dominates local and state preservation policy in the U.S., I will specifically refer to federal preservation policy in this presentation, even though it often overlaps at the local and state levels. Now, let's briefly cover some basic definitions of laws, regulations, and guidelines to make sure that we're all on the same page. So what is a preservation law? Democratically elected bodies within local, state, and federal governments create and pass legislation which becomes a law. This is pretty common knowledge. There are many laws that define preservation policy, but none is more important than the National Historic Preservation Act that the U.S. Congress passed in 1966. Another important law is the Federal Rehabilitation Tax Credit, which is more popularly known as the Historic Tax Credit, which Congress passed in 1976. There are many, many more laws, especially when considering state and local preservation laws, but I'm not going to cover them right here in this particular presentation. Regulations are how laws are implemented. At the federal level, the Administrative Procedures Act empowers federal agencies to take a law passed by Congress and create what is known as a regulation in order to implement particular sections of a law. For instance, Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act is technically a law, and in its entirety is just 93 words. It took more than 16,000 words to convert the intent of Congress into a regulation known as 36 CFR 800, which consists of specific rules that must be followed when a federal undertaking that might impact an historic resource is being considered. Other regulations include 36 CFR Part 68, which is known as the Secretary of the Interior Standards, and 36 CFR 60, which is known as the National Register of Historic Places. And of course, there are many, many more. Whenever you hear in the news about a government agency's rulemaking process, this is a reference to an agency that is creating or amending a regulation. Per the Administrative Procedures Act, there is a requirement that the proposed regulation be published to the Federal Register and the public be given a chance to comment on the proposed regulation. Theoretically, agencies can take this public input into consideration and make changes to the proposed regulation, but the incorporation of this public input is not a requirement. Prior to the publication of the Federal Register in an online format in 1994, the government printing office printed the Federal Register every working day and mailed it to special law libraries that were often difficult for members of the public to access. Because all of the existing regulations that define federal preservation policy were fixed in place prior to 1994, the only way a member of the public could comment on proposed rulemaking processes from the National Park Service or the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation was to read every single copy of the Federal Register on a daily basis, which, as you might imagine, was pretty unlikely. Functionally, what this meant is that the rulemaking process that defines federal preservation policy today had very little public input. The vast majority of people who were aware of the creation of these regulations and thus commented on their creation were the professionals that the National Park Service and the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation contacted directly. For the most part, the American public was therefore entirely unaware of the rulemaking process in the 1970s and early 1980s, in which the vast majority of regulations that define federal policy were created. Each state in the United States has a very similar process for creating regulations and laws passed by state legislatures, but time and time again, state preservation laws and the resulting regulations either mirrored or simply referenced federal regulations. At the state level, there was very little creativity or public input in the creation of state preservation regulations. In essence, state legislatures and state agencies rubber stamp federal preservation policy over and over again. But, per the 10th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, all powers not granted explicitly to the federal government are given to the states. The states can then pass these powers to local municipalities. The Supreme Court has repeatedly upheld this right of states and local municipalities to implement their own laws and regulations as they see fit to regulate private property. And certainly historic preservation as an activity is not mentioned at all in the Constitution. Yet, in the implementation of preservation policy at the state and local levels in the U.S., these governmental entities have largely failed to exercise their authority in crafting preservation laws and regulations that are reflective of their constituents' values, needs, and priorities. Instead, have chosen to defer to federal precedent. Because federal preservation policy in its crafting failed to reflect the values of the American public, state legislatures, and by extension, most local municipalities have long been complicit in perpetuating this exclusionary social injustice. What this rubber stamping process means is that state and local preservation policy is almost always identical to federal preservation policy. With few exceptions, preservation policy at every governmental level in the U.S. is federal preservation policy, even though state and local governments were never required and could not be required via the Constitution to adopt federal preservation policy. Now we arrive at the third and last major element of federal preservation policy, and that is guidelines. A preservation guideline is an official or de facto policy that is not a law or regulation and thus is not, with few exceptions, subject to judicial review. Guidelines are therefore directly enforced by federal, state, and local government agencies whose work intersects with historic preservation. From the perspective of the public, a guideline often is indistinguishable from a regulation, but there are critical differences, especially in relation to flexibility. For instance, there is no federal regulation that actually defines historical integrity, or more specifically, there is no federal regulation that defines location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. Instead, more than a half-century ago, staff at the National Park Service independently defined these terms without any kind of democratic rule-making process at all. What this also means is that the National Park Service could redefine the definition of historical integrity as long as the name of the 7 kinds of integrity are preserved, entirely independent of any legislative or rule-making process. To be clear, staff in the National Park Service have complete authority over these definitions, but have not, in a half-century, ever amended them. The Park Service has also not chosen to amend the instructions on how historical integrity should be applied in evaluating historic properties, even though this also is not defined in a law or regulation. The vast majority of work conducted by governmental entities in the name of historic preservation in the U.S. is controlled by guidelines that have always had the potential of being malleable in their enforcement and content. Yet, few governmental agencies have exercised their authority in undertaking this kind of work. Governmental staff, and especially leaders in these agencies, have a responsibility in considering how a failure to exercise flexibility over their preservation guidelines creates social justice issues. For decades, local, state, and federal government agencies have chosen to implement and sustain rigid and often discriminatory interpretations of historical significance, historical integrity, or design standards when the corresponding law or regulation allowed for interpretation and flexibility. It is time that governmental agencies recognize their own agency in addressing social justice issues in historic preservation policy. It's important now to take a step back from the contemporary state of historic preservation policy and explore its genesis, or how it was created. Where did the concepts and values that have been incorporated into historic preservation laws, and especially regulations and guidelines, originate? Who got to decide what these concepts and values were, and who was excluded from this conversation? Because of who was excluded, what kinds of concepts and values might have been omitted as well? These are questions that are rarely asked, especially by leaders in the historic preservation field who may be overloaded with the daily check-the-box exigencies of their work. It is impossible to disentangle the development of preservation doctrine, starting in the 19th century, from the development of preservation policy. They are part of the same historical continuum. Preservation policy turned the ideas of a very few aristocratic white men from Europe and later the United States into regulations that millions of Americans of all racial and ethnic identities now have to follow. In other words, preservation doctrine is a form of cultural authority based on the beliefs and values that an inconceivably small group of self-proclaimed preservation experts have discussed and mutually agreed to promulgate over the past 2 centuries. So who are these godfathers of preservation? Let me provide some prominent examples. A description of preservation doctrine usually starts with the foundational role of John Ruskin, an English art critic and lover of all things Gothic, especially cathedrals. It was his chapter on the Lamp of Memory, from his 7 Lamps of Architecture book, published in London in 1849, that substantiated historic preservation's long-held reverence for the intact retention of the fabric of old buildings. Ruskin also happened to be a racist who argued for the preservation of chattel slavery, and in his later life literally lost his mind. He went crazy. William Morris, a friend of Ruskin and a foundational member of the arts and crafts movement, established the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, or SPAB. SPAB's 1877 manifesto, which is still promoted by this organization today, began to codify the beliefs of a few wealthy white European men who believed that their material culture, especially its relationship to the arts and crafts of the Middle Ages, was superior to all other cultures in the world at that time. Camillo Boito, an Italian restoration architect and aesthete, is credited with promoting an objective, scientific approach to the conservation of buildings that dominates preservation policy to this day. Boito's work is therefore an example of one of the earliest attempts to sideline broader humanistic and social science arguments that provide nuance to the concepts of significance and authenticity, especially from the perspective of the public. His book on restoration, published in 1893 in Italian, contained many of the concepts and values that would become encoded in today's federal preservation policy, including the need to differentiate old building fabric from new. In fact, Boito had a passage in his book where he advocates for this position because his mind grows fatigued from having to deduce what is old and what has changed in an historic building. By differentiating old and new fabric, his mind no longer has to work so hard. By objectively conserving the fabric of the building, its interpretation also becomes more objective, according to Boito. William Sumner Appleton, the founder of the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, now called Historic New England, has been credited with professionalizing the field of historic preservation at the turn of the 20th century to his emphasis on a scientific archaeological approach to building preservation. Appleton, in his writings and speeches, was patently racist in his view that Northern European material culture and the race that created its buildings was superior to all other races. For him, historic preservation was about preserving the cultural dominance and authority of white people of Northern European descent. Charles Peterson was a white American preservation architect who founded the Historic American Building Survey in the 1930s. He is considered to be the godfather of American preservation. It was through Habs that the first concepts and values of historical significance and historical integrity were established. In fact, prior to World War II, the definitions of these concepts were already remarkably congruent to what has become encoded in the regulations and guidelines for the National Register of Historic Places by the late 1960s and early 1970s. Ronald F. Lee, who was the chief historian of the National Park Service in the 1950s, played a fundamental role in helping to solidify the concepts of historical significance and integrity that would become a permanent part of federal preservation policy by the early 1970s. Along with a few of his colleagues in the National Park Service, he traveled to various places in Northern Europe to collect best practices in historic preservation. Lee's work in the 1950s still remains a core part of the federal preservation policy. As a result, a significant part of federal preservation policy today remains entrenched in concepts and values that Northern white Europeans thought were cutting edge more than 70 years ago, and which today most European countries have moved beyond. Now we arrive at the white men who helped craft the legislation that would become the 1966 National Historic Preservation Act. Two men, in particular, played outsized roles in this work: Gordon Gray and Albert Raines. At the time, Gray was the president of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and Raines was a representative from Alabama in the U.S. House. Both men held publicly espoused racist views and defended segregation in the American South. In the case of Gray, he resisted integrating the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill when he was president of the university. In the case of Raines, he repeatedly blocked legislation that sought to dismantle the Jim Crow South and framed historic preservation in narratives related to the lost cause. The House committee that they served on, chaired by Raines, drafted the text of the legislation that Congress passed in 1966. In total, the legislative text that would become the National Historic Preservation Act was produced by a handful of other white men and published in a book called With Heritage So Rich. A product of its time, the stories and the legislative text focus exclusively on white material culture. Brown Morton III was the primary author of the Secretary of the Interior Standards, which he co-authored in 1977. In interviews, Morton admitted that the standards, which became a federal regulation, was a direct translation of the Venice Charter, an international doctrine that a small group of mostly white European male architects, historians, and archaeologists crafted in Venice in 1964. It is important to note that Morton has since publicly distanced himself from his own work, stating that his goal in creating the standards was that they should serve as guidance in the preservation of the authenticity of buildings. But he says, in practice, too many preservation practitioners treat the standards too rigidly and too dogmatically. So, why is it important to talk about the people who helped create what became federal preservation policy? The answer is that the concepts and values in preservation policy only represented the concepts and values of a group of white men that could all easily fit in a medium-sized room. Think about this. Federal historic preservation policy, as it has existed for the past half-century, has never incorporated concepts and values outside of the self-appointed group of white male preservation experts. All this begs a question that, in the middle of the 20th century, when federal preservation policy was being crafted, whose voices were omitted? Well, no one bothered to ask the African American community in West Mount Airy, Philadelphia, who in the 1950s and 60s created and sustained their own community-driven culture to preserve the historic train stations in their neighborhood. No one bothered to talk to Marcia Greenlee, an African-American scholar in the early 1970s who helped shine a light on the need to identify and preserve places of importance to African Americans. No one bothered to talk to the African-American residents of Mecca Flats, Chicago, who in the 1950s tried to preserve their iconic apartment building. No one bothered to talk with the countless Latinx people in the American Southwest, who for hundreds of years have sustained a tradition of preserving their tangible and intangible heritage. No one bothered to talk to the indigenous peoples in the U.S., even though federal preservation policy, in the years since the National Historic Preservation Act has been passed, has had a corrosive impact on their culture, people, and identity. No one bothered to talk to the people who don't have property or wealth, and what they thought historic preservation should be and how it could benefit them. Today, federal preservation policy, which again has become the law of the land at nearly all local and state levels in the U.S., continues to perpetuate these and many other omissions. So, in the third decade of the 21st century, whose voices remain excluded from federal preservation policy? Well, that would be African American people, Asian American people, Latinx people, indigenous people, and many, many others with minoritized racial, ethnic, religious, gender, and sexual identities. What might preservation policy at all governmental levels look like if it were to include more diverse voices in its concepts and values? Well, we might find that, as Kenyatta McLean's research at MIT uncovered, some African American communities don't think of time in a linear fashion, where progress is eventual or continual. We might find, as Andrea Roberts has with her work on the Texas Freedom Colonies, that old places that look quite ordinary and have very few written records to back up their objective history are very important in creating and sustaining an identity of resistance for specific African American groups. We might find that an important value of old places to some people is how they foster individual and group identity and place attachment, as social science researchers have discovered. We might find, as social science researchers Sarah Driscoll and Sophie Trauwalter reveal, that for some marginalized groups, the aesthetic value of older places is uniquely associated with the dominant racial group. What that means is that high-style buildings can instill feelings of repression and revulsion rather than more positive connotations for many Americans. We might learn from listening to the stories of local members of the Latinx community in San Antonio that when government sanctions the destruction of ordinary-looking places with deep community history, like La Gloria, this community perceives this action as a kind of cultural genocide. There are many other possibilities, but there is, as of the creation of this video, no public forum for a discussion of this nature. There is no funding to support social science work like this, and few policymakers willing to engage in this discussion. All of this could and should change. Now, let's briefly review some specific policy issues to give some concrete grounding to this. Here are 6 important examples, although there are many more than this. Definitions of historical significance and integrity that are a core part of preservation policy have only been informed through the perspective of highly educated, white, property-owning men, many of whom held racist and classist points of view. No respect for local knowledge. Okay, what is local knowledge? Think about people's lived experiences and contexts with older buildings and places. If you talk to someone who lives in a particular older place, the reasons why this person or his, her, their broader community value a place is not restricted to the kinds of objective written facts that historic preservation policy enshrines. Or to put it in another way, federal preservation policy only gives legitimacy to the academic concepts and values of historians, architectural historians, and archaeologists, while sidelining the ways in which most people value older places. There are other ways of understanding what makes an older place authentic than through the 7 aspects of historical integrity found in federal preservation policy. A case in point is the World Heritage Convention. The U.S. was a major player in creating the World Heritage Convention in the 1970s. It originally included the definition of historical integrity used to this day in federal preservation policy. In the 1980s, however, the U.S. definitions of historical integrity were removed and replaced with new concepts that better embraced intangible heritage and people's emotional connection to place. Social science research in the past 20 years has shown time and time again that a fundamental reason why older places are authentic to the public is because they feel authentic, which relates to place attachment and place identity. Federal preservation policy includes none of these concepts that are deeply meaningful to most people. Federal historic preservation policy primarily benefits property owners. How can preservation policy change in a way to make it more meaningful and useful for people who do not own property or do not have wealth? A first step would be to center affordable housing policies within broader preservation policy. Federal preservation policy needs to promote more effective and meaningful community engagement and participation and ways in which experts can be good facilitators. More specifically, preservation planning within federal preservation policy needs to change. It should not be acceptable for experts to predetermine why a place is significant and then seek approval for this decision from the public. Instead, we need to employ ways in which experts can better understand the public's meanings and values related to older buildings and places, and then respect and use these values within planning processes. The key to this change process is the need to understand and respect local knowledge. Lastly, federal preservation policy needs to promote funding for primary research in historic preservation to better understand how to incorporate local knowledge, which would include increasing participation from people with minoritized identities. After more than a half-century of stasis in federal preservation policy, which again, state and local governments have freely chosen to promulgate, it's time to consider changes. These changes can happen, to some extent, independently of any need to engage in a legislative process. Many can happen by simply revising the internal guidelines and de facto policies you use right now in your organization. Simply put, you have agency in your agency. Now you know why public historic preservation policy is a big deal.